The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome back to And Colossally, That's History, with me, Richard Williams, and my good friend, Matt Bishop.
Thank you very much, Richard. And now, we've covered a lot of ground in this first series of our podcast, from the brand new Brawn team's remarkable championship success in 2009, even to how Hitler and the Nazis weaponized motorsport in the 1930s. But one thing all our stories we've told so far have in common is that they've all been dominated by men. So today we thought we'd redress the balance, and with good reason, because motorsport today is changing, albeit, in my view, far too slowly. Opportunities are opening up for women, yes. First via W Series, which I used to work for, which briefly thrived but didn't survive, and now via the F1 Academy, the Formula One Academy, among other initiatives. Recently, I spent a wet weekend, of course, because we are in April or the spring in the UK, so a wet weekend at Donington for the British Touring Car Championship and at Silverstone for the British GTs. And here and there, in the support series especially, I'm talking about Porsches and Ginettas and Minis and stuff like that, there were a few women racing, albeit obviously still only very much a minority. And at senior levels, I'm talking about Formula One and Formula Two, it's still entirely male, overwhelmingly white and completely heterosexual while we're on the subject. And the money required to get there is increasingly becoming a barrier to entry to all bar the sons, because it is mostly sons, of the very rich, or male drivers, because it is mostly male, who are lucky enough to be backed by the very rich, for some reason other than lucky accident of birth, I suppose, if I can put it that way. And it is so expensive. International FIA Formula 3 is 1.5 million euros now per driver per season with a top team. And Formula 2 is 2.5 million euros per driver for a season with a top team. The higher tiers of international motorsport, they're often referred to as the billionaire boys club. which is, I'm afraid, sadly accurate as a description of, if you could call it, the staircase of access. And it really isn't a good thing, in my view. And it wasn't always quite like that. Motorsport has always been expensive, but it hasn't always been quite as expensive to access in that way as it is now.
Indeed, and of course it's even harder for women who have to overcome decades of a belief that somehow, whether mentally or physically, they're not equipped to challenge men on a racetrack. So it's never been easy, and we thought it would be apt in this episode to look back at some of motorsport's pioneering female racers, inspiring drivers who competed on equal terms with their male peers and who achieved, against the odds, some incredible things.
Exactly, Richard. You said against the odds there. And that's a correct phrase in my view, because in a traditionally male-dominated sport, which ours is, it's been harder for women to make a name for themselves, hasn't it?
Yes, and it goes back quite a long way. I think of a very symbolic incident at the French Grand Prix sometime in the 1950s at Reims, when Maria Theresa De Filippis, an Italian woman driver, pretty good one too.
Who we'll come to later.
We'll be talking about her later, indeed. She wanted to race at Reims that year, and the race director, a character called Toto Roche, who was a rather colourful man.
Chubby too, I think.
Chubby, famous for insisting on starting the race with a flag, as you did in those days, starting in front of the front row of cars and then leaping out of the way as they all roared off. And indeed, some of the drivers tried to run over his toes, I think. Anyway, when Maria Theresa applied to enter the race, she was told by Toto Roche, no, the only helmet a woman should wear is the one at the hairdresser's. And that sums up the macho attitude that hindered women's progress at the very top level, Grand Prix racing, before World War II and Formula One after it. And part of that was the belief that women weren't physically up to the rigours of racing.
Yeah, motor racing series have always been open to both men and women, since time immemorial. But they mostly haven't been played or raced in by men and women in quite the same way. But they've always been open to women. But let's look at Formula One, because it's very obviously the prism via which the world views motorsport, the premier series. And we can see that in this way, it's absolutely not where it needs to be. 2024 is the 75th season of the official Formula One World Championship, and that's three quarters of a century, and knocking on, I think, high hundreds, nearly 1,000 drivers have driven in Formula One, raced in proper championship Formula One Grand Prix. I mean, I don't mean non-championship races, because there were tons of non-championship races, for instance, South African races that were driven by South African drivers who never raced in other proper Formula One races, if you wouldn't mind me saying, and Australia and South America and so on and so forth. So those proper championship Formula One Grand Prix, about 1,000 competitors have driven over the past 75 years, and guess how many women? 2. 2 women have raced in them in that time. The woman you just mentioned, Maria Theresa De Filippis, who raced in Formula One Grand Prix racing in 1958 and 59. She started 3 Grand Prix in that period. And Lella Lombardi in 1975 and 1976.
Another Italian,
yes. And she started 12 Grand Prix, so more than De Filippis, but not a huge number. And that's it. Others have tried more recently, but not succeeded. They did not qualify. So we haven't actually seen a woman start a championship Formula One Grand Prix for 48 years, knocking on half a century. Yes, as I said, there's 3 other drivers who have tried and failed to qualify for proper Formula One Grand Prix. Davina Galitza in the late 1970s, Desiree Wilson in 1980, and Giovanna Amati in 1992. But that's it. No woman has even entered or attempted to race in a proper Formula One Grand Prix, let alone qualified for one, for 32 years. Why is that? Well, part of the purpose of this podcast is to try to answer that question, and we will come to that. But if I may, let's just look at a sport in which women have been very successful, have become enormous stars, have made a lot of money, in fact. Tennis. You know, Serena Williams is one of the greatest, by any measure, she's one of the greatest tennis players in the history of that sport. But nobody would ever blame her for not being able to play singles against Rafa Nadal. And she wouldn't be able to. But we understand that. With many sports, most sports, actually, the differences in strength and speed make it impossible for women and men to compete on level terms. That applies, obviously, I mentioned tennis. That applies also to all other ball sports. It applies to football and rugby. Obviously, it applies to combat sports, you know, boxing and wrestling, and all of athletics, track and field, Olympic sports in that sense. They're all segregated by men's competition and women's. But there are some sports in which women can and do compete with men on level terms. Equestrianism, that's an example. But what we don't know, these are all facts. What we don't know, because the sample size is too small to draw reliable conclusions, and because absolutely serious scientific, empirical, experiment-based research has never been done, or not yet, we don't know whether women's failure to make it to the top level of motorsport is a result of the same deficit of strength and speed that I was talking about when I was comparing Serena Williams and Rafa Nadal, or whether it's a lack of opportunity. I know I've rabbited on for a while now, and I'm going to ask you to answer it. But before I do, I think it may be a bit of both. You know, women are also, by the way, far less successful than men at certain sports that clearly do not require strength and speed. You know, I'm thinking of snooker, darts, those kind of sports. And that surely must be a consequence of far fewer girls taking up those sports when they're young, as a result of which far fewer of those girls grow up to be successful snooker players and darts players when they're women. But as far as motor racing concerned, we simply don't know, because the sample size is too small and the scientific research hasn't been done. What do you think?
Well, it's difficult. And there's a saying, you've got to see it to be it. So, you know, until someone makes it, it's very difficult to tell whether others will follow. And it's a process that can take a long time. So let's go back in time and let's talk about some of the notable female drivers from history. One of the very first, she was certainly the first or second, was Camille Dugaste, a Parisian whose husband died when she was in her 20s, leaving her a very wealthy widow. And she was a noted balloonist, skier, parachute jumper, fencer, rifle shot, tobogganist, horsewoman, and concert pianist.
Wow, well, pretty multi-talented.
A Renaissance woman. Besides all that, in 1901, she came 33rd out of 47 finishers in the Paris to Berlin race, 750 miles, one of those great and unthinkably challenging open road events during the earliest days of the sport. And apparently she received specially warm cheers from the large crowds along the way. But I'd also like to talk about a couple of drivers who've interested me, particularly when I was doing some research into the history of Le Mans not long ago. The first of them was a French woman called Odette Sicot, who, with her driving companion Marguerite Mareuse, they were the first women to compete at Le Mans in the 24-hour race in 1930 in Mareuse's Bugatti. And they finished the race pretty far down. But then, I think 3 or 4 years later, Sicot, in an Alfa Romeo, finished fourth, which is still the best finish ever by a woman at Le Mans. And lots of women have competed at Le Mans over the years. And that was in 1932. And then just as an example of the kind of British woman who was driving racing cars in the 1930s, there's a woman called Doreen Evans, or to be more exact, Doreen Barbara Mignonette Evans.
What a name.
Yeah, what a girl, who was the younger sister of two young men from a family that had a garage in Wandsworth in South London.
I may just tell you that I walked past it, that garage, the Evans' MG garage, as it was.
Yes, it was. Just
next to Wandsworth Common.
Yep.
It's now an estate agent.
Oh, well, there we are. Sic transit gloria. It was called the Bellevue Garage at the time, and they were famous. They tuned racing cars for people who wanted to race at Brooklands, and they raced themselves, and they had a very good relationship with MG. So Doreen raced MGs at Brooklands, and in 1935 she was one of 6 women drivers who raced at Le Mans together in a team of 3 MG midgets, 750cc unsupercharged MG midgets, and they were nicknamed the Dancing Daughters because that was a recent popular film starring Joan Crawford.
And it would be fair to say, if one's allowed to say this, that they were fine-looking young women, were they not?
Yeah, and they were pretty interesting women too. One of them became the motoring correspondent of Vogue. One of them worked at Bletchley Park. One of them married John Bolster, who you may remember as the BBC's pit lane reporter.
Yes.
Well, you won't remember, because it was the 1960s. Or 50s.
Yes,
but
I know of.
Yeah, and he was the Ted Kravitz of his day, I think we could say.
Yeah.
Anyway, they were interesting women, and they drove these MGs at Le Mans, and they came 24th, 25th, and 26th, having running convoy pretty much for 24 hours. And the only thing that went wrong in the whole, one of them had to change a rear light bulb, I think. Otherwise,
pretty trouble-free run then. In all told.
Yep.
Didn't Doreen Evans end up marrying an American businessman who? Didn't he own the Denver Broncos, or am I remembering it wrongly?
I believe he did, yeah. She went to live in, I think, Colorado. And she'd finished racing. She had a big smash at Brooklands. She was in a very beautiful single-seater MG. And something happened, and she went off at the members' banking and she walked away from it, but I think that was the end of her career. Yes, and then indeed she went to live in America, got married, got divorced, got married again. An interesting woman, but there were lots of those, particularly at Brooklands, who were part of, accepted as part of the scenery, part of the competition.
Absolutely. And, we could talk about many more of them at that time, but we have got to ration ourselves. I think perhaps the next one we should talk about, we've mentioned her en passant already, is Maria Theresa De Filippis. And funny enough, or perhaps not, depends on your view, she started off as a keen horsewoman and tennis player. Fancy that. And then after the Second World War, by which time she was well into her 20s, she tried motor racing for the first time. And she actually won the very first race she ever entered, which was, it wasn't a high level of motorsport, I will say that. She was in a Fiat 500 Topolino, and it was a 10-kilometre race, 6 miles, hill climb. But she still won it. I don't know about the opposition, but she still won it.
You can imagine it was Italy, 1948. The boys would have been trying.
They would have been.
In the Topolino.
She won.
Topolini.
Yes, Topolini. She won. And then she entered the Italian Sports Car Championship, and she actually finished second in that championship in 1954, and that led Maserati to hire her. Although she didn't actually race in a proper Formula One Grand Prix for Maserati for 4 more years, 1958. But she was the girlfriend, was she not, of Luigi Musso, who was a Ferrari driver? Yeah,
she was for a bit, I think. And certainly he lent her he had a Maserati sports car, and I think he lent her his car for a bit. Her arrangement with Maserati, I think a lot of people had similar arrangements that they paid Maserati, and Maserati would prepare a car.
So she was a pay driver, in a sense?
Kind of. And she came from a wealthy background. She'd been born and grew up in a palazzo just outside Naples. So,
as you do.
As well as, yes.
Well, not me and not you.
No, neither.
No.
Anyway, but it became obvious that she was more than competent at the wheel.
She was more than competent. And I think there's a story that in the non-championship, because of course there were tons of non-championship races back in the day. In fact, in some years there were more non-championship Formula One races than championship Formula One Grand Prix. And in the Syracuse Grand Prix, which was non-championship in 1958, she did well. She finished fifth. But in qualifying, Musso, obviously a Ferrari driver, she was a Maserati driver, Musso said, "Follow me around and I'll show you where to brake and where to turn in and where to do all that kind of thing." And showed her the lap, despite the fact that they were racing one for Ferrari and one for Maserati. But I don't think it really mattered because Musso won by literally a mile, put it on the pole and won by literally a mile. But anyway, she finished fifth. Now, she also had a friendship, but was it only a friendship with Jean Bérard?
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah.
But I think they were quite close because he let her race his Porsche. He'd got a couple of Porsches, one of which he'd had made into a single-seater. And she tried to qualify for the Monaco Grand Prix in that car in 1959, having qualified in a couple of Grand Prix the previous season at Spa and Monza in a Maserati. But she didn't manage to qualify the Bérard Porsche, as it was known, at Monaco in 59. And then not long after that, Bérard was driving his other Porsche at Avus, the bank track in Berlin, and he went over the lip of the banking and killed himself.
And she was devastated, wasn't she?
She was, and I think that contributed to her retirement from the cockpit.
She wasn't as quick as, Musso. She definitely wasn't as quick as Bérard. But then not that many were.
No, but think of a lot of those people, who were driving Maseratis in Grand Prix at that time, like Giorgio Scarlatti or Ottorino Volontario. They were amateurs. Yes. She was as good as them.
Yeah, yes. Volontario wasn't a fast man, it would be fair to say.
That's true.
There's a wonderful picture of him at leisurely progress, making leisurely progress at the Nürburgring with his hands, the 2:45 is the correct. Yeah. His are about 25 to 5. As if he was tootling along. He probably was tootling on. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not maligning her at all.
No. But then she married and had a daughter and lived a pleasant, happy life. And then she was in, I think, 1979, she joined the organisation with the delightful title of the Club International des Anciens Pilotes.
Indeed.
The Old Drivers Club, yes. Which is a very distinguished body. Everybody you could think of from the 50s and 60s who'd survived, which wasn't everybody, was a member of it. Stirling Moss and all those people, going back to, I think a leading light was Tullio de Graffenried, who'd raced right at the beginning of Formula One. And she became the sort of leading light of that, I think, the kind of convener. Can't remember what her title was, but
So she was a trailblazer and a pioneer in the context of the subject of our podcast, women racing drivers. She absolutely was. She was therefore very important.
Yeah, historically she was. And she raced against Stirling Moss, of course, which makes me think of Stirling's sister.
Pat Moss.
Yeah, another driver we ought to talk about, although she didn't race in Formula One.
No, but rallying.
Yeah, she was an enormously important rally driver. She was Stirling's younger sister, I think about 4 years younger. Like him, she grew up riding horses on the family farm and show jumping very competitively, winning lots and lots of rosettes. I imagine they won at Gymkhanas in those days.
I'm sure.
And cups, and as Stirling did. And then when she was 18, she was going out with a guy called Ken Gregory, who became Stirling's manager. And he got her into rallying. And I think with Stirling's help, she got hold of a Triumph TR2 and started rallying. And then, showed talent, clearly right from the beginning, and got a deal with BMC, the British Motor Corporation, which then was the sort of nationalised umbrella owner of all sorts
Which became British Leyland later.
Became British Leyland. So she spent the next few years driving all sorts of cars in rallies, Austin Westminsters, and all, I think early on, she finished fourth in the RAC rally in a Morris Minor, for instance.
Amazing.
And then in 1958, she won the European Ladies Rally Championship for the first time. She won that 5 years. And in 1960, she won the Liège Rally in a big Healey, an Austin Healey 3000, which is the car with which she really became identified. And and she was second in the Coupe des Alpes, and she had lots of good results. And most significantly, possibly, in 1961, she won the Tulip Rally in a Mini Cooper. And that was the first time a Mini had won a rally. And, of course, it became one of the great rally cars.
I was going to say, big Healeys and Mini Coopers is what you think of when you think of Pat Moss.
You do. Mm-hmm. But then in 1963, she married Erik Karlsson, the great Swedish rally driver, and he drove for Saab. And so she switched and joined Saab too, and got lots of decent results. And then later in the 60s, she drove for Lancia, not quite so successfully, and also for Alpine Renault. But by that time, she was having a family. So she retired in 1974, and very sadly, 2008, she died of cancer.
Very sad.
But a very significant figure in motorsport.
Absolutely.
And not just because she was a woman.
Yes, and not just because she was Stirling Moss's sister either. So I think that's probably a good time to take a break. And when we come back, we'll look at what could be considered, perhaps, a golden age, if there has been one, for female competitors.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Welcome back. As I said in part one, only 2 female drivers have ever started a proper championship Formula One Grand Prix. Maria Theresa De Filippis and Lella Lombardi, 2 Italians. We've talked about De Filippis, so let's talk about Lombardi. A slight aside here, but an interesting one. She was incidentally one of only 3 known LGBTQ plus Formula One drivers. She was a lesbian, and her partner, Fiorenza, attended quite a few of her races with her, actually. The other 2, in parenthesis, I'll say, the other 2 were a gay man, Mike Beutler, who raced privateer marches, paid for by admirers, in the early 70s. But very sadly, he died of AIDS in Los Angeles, aged just 48 in 1988. And the third is Nisha Cabral, from Portugal, who raced Coopers in the early 60s. Then, in 1964, an old ATS run by Derrington Francis. There's a name to conjure with. Derrington Francis, which was the short-lived Formula One team founded and run by Stirling Moss's, we're going back to Stirling Moss again en passant, by Stirling Moss's old mechanic Alf Francis. I say short-lived because it was very short-lived. Derrington Francis entered just one Formula One Grand Prix, which was at Monza in 1964, which it did not finish DNF. And it folded. Here's here's a story. It folded because Dan Gurney then shunted the only car, in testing. And they gave up after that. I mean, this is what I'd call on Twitter a hashtag anorak fact.
Yeah, indeed. And you say it was an old ATS. Well, ATSs weren't any good when they were new.
That's true. It was a bad car to buy.
Not much of a chance with an old one.
No, indeed. Anyway, Nisha Cabral kept his sexuality closeted, secret, hidden throughout most of his life. But here's the thing. He actually came out as bisexual at the age of 75. And he died 4 years ago, aged 86. So I can only hope that those last 11 years were a weight off his mind. Anyway, back to Lella Lombardi. She was the daughter of a butcher who ran a small butcher's shop in a village in Piedmont in northwest Italy. And her first experience of driving, I think I'm right, am I not, Richard, it was behind the wheel of her dad's delivery van.
Yes, indeed.
There you are. So she had no money, or no money to speak of, but she had plenty of guts, Lella Lombardi. And luckily, money enough was found, because Count Vittorio, is it Zanon or Zanon? I've never known. Zanon.
Oh, Zanon, I think.
Zanon. Shall we say Zanon?
We will.
People will tell us if it should have been Zanon. Let's go with Zanon. Anyway, Vittorio Zanon, I'm making it sound quite Italian there. Anyway, he was a count, and he took her under his wing. And his coffee company, which of course everyone will have heard of, Lavazza, sponsored her in Formula One. Actually, Zanon supported drivers he liked. That's what he did. And after Lombardi, he sponsored, or at least financially helped, Ronnie Peterson, great driver, Michele Alboreto, very good driver, and even Ayrton Senna. I think he helped him get him out of his Tolman contract, or helped with some of those legal bills. Anyway, back to Lombardi. Famously, she's the only woman to score a point in a proper championship Formula One Grand Prix, or half a point to be precise, because it happened in the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix at Montjuic in Barcelona, which ended before half distance because there was a huge shunt with a number of spectators killed, very sadly. So the single point she would have got for finishing sixth ended up being half a point. But she was a pretty good driver, actually. In sports cars, she did rather well. In 1979, after she'd finished with Formula One, she won the Pergusa 6 hours and the Vallelunga 6 hours. And I think she even tried NASCAR at one point. Anyway, she died aged 50, very young, of cancer, and was survived by her partner, Fiorenza. Very sad.
Yes, she raced at Le Mans with Mark Thatcher once, in fact, in an Acela.
I think that's a hashtag anorak fact.
I think it is. That was 1980. And, she was a really good sports car driver. Mark Thatcher, well, their race ended when he stuffed it into the sandbank at Tertre Rouge, anyway. But as you say, she was the first woman driver to register a world championship point, or half a point. And I remember a quote from Robin Hurd, who was one of the senior figures at March, the team she was driving for. And he said, what impressed him about her was her professionalism. She had no airs or graces. She didn't come with an entourage. She just turned up and drove and went away and did a really good job. So that's who she was. But there was a woman driver who actually won a Formula One race, albeit in the short-lived British Aurora AFX F1 series.
Yes, so not a championship Formula One Grand Prix.
No.
But a Formula One race.
Yep, and it was a perfectly decent, respectable series with some good drivers and reasonable cars in it. And we're talking about Desiree Wilson.
Yeah.
Who was born in South Africa, in the Transvaal. Her father had been a South African champion motorcycle racer, I think, and she got into racing when she was 5 years old in something called micro midgets, tiny little things.
If midgets aren't small enough.
Yeah. And then she graduated to midgets.
Yes.
And did very well. And then to Formula V and Formula Ford. She was South African champion in the mid-70s. And then she came to Europe. There was a kind of Driver to Europe campaign, which I think had brought Jodie Scheckter over. But there wasn't quite so much money around when she came. So she came with her. She was married already to another racer who sort of put his career aside because he could see that she was more talented. And they came here, and they both scuffled around to get a drive. She drove in Formula Ford 2000 for a bit. And then in 78, she started racing in the Aurora F1 Championship in an Ensign, I think, to begin with. And she did all sorts of impressive things. You know, she was first in the Evening News Trophy at Brands Hatch, ahead of Eliseo Salazar and Giacomo Agostini, a great motorcycle champion who was having a go at single-seater racing.
Eliseo Salazar, who famously had his fisticuffs with Nelson Piquet.
Indeed.
And blocked me when I tweeted about it.
Perhaps because he didn't win the fight.
Yeah, maybe.
Bad memory. And what she also did, very impressively, was join up with Alain de Cadenet to race his sports car in the World Endurance Championship in those days. And in 1980, they won the Monza 1,000 kilometres and the Silverstone 6 hours. You know, and they were against some pretty impressive competition.
Yeah.
She was going to race with him at Le Mans, and they all the drivers had to go through a qualifying procedure individually at Le Mans. And she went out, put up a lap time on her first lap. And her second lap, she had a big shunt through no fault of her own. But for some reason, the organisers decided to lose all the records of her first lap, and they wouldn't let her race, unfortunately, which was a great shame.
Great shame.
But anyway, she was, she was a significant racer. And that Evening News Trophy at Brands Hatch, that's a marker for women in motorsport, for sure.
Yeah, look, I like Desiree Wilson. I like her a lot. And Davina Galitza, who I think we're also going to have to mention. And actually, I invited them both to attend W Series races in 2019, which was the first season of W Series, when I was W Series comms director. And they were and are both, I think, wonderful, wonderful women. I think Desiree Wilson may well have been the best female driver, if one wants to, announce an accolade of that nature, the best female driver we've seen so far in Formula One. I mean, not only did she win that British Aurora AFX Formula One race that you mentioned at Brands Hatch, in an ex-Jodie Scheckter Wolf, by the way, but she also raced in the 1981 South African Grand Prix for Tyrrell, which was only retrospectively declared a non-championship Formula One race, so it would otherwise have been another person alongside De Filippis and Lombardi, the third woman who had raced in a championship Grand Prix, but it was unfortunately declared non-championship. Particularly unfortunate for Carlos Reutemann fans like me, because he would have ended up being world champion if the points had counted. As it was, he lost the championship by a single point to Piquet. This is 1981. Anyway, she qualified for that race only a few tenths behind her Tyrrell teammate, Eddie Cheever. No slouch, Eddie Cheever. But she didn't finish DNF. And the year before, also in a Tyrrell, but this was in a non-championship Formula One race, the Race of Champions at Brands Hatch, so we're talking about 1980, she'd actually out-qualified and out-raced her teammate, Gordon Smiley, if you remember him, and she finished the race in 9th place. I mean, not too shabby at all. It's a sad story, this one, though, because Smiley was killed in qualifying for the 1982 Indy 500 in one of the ghastliest single-car shunts in racing history. I don't even intend to describe it. And Desiree Wilson was his teammate then as well. They were friends, in fact. But perhaps surprisingly, therefore, she didn't qualify for that race. She must have been extremely upset.
No, she didn't in 1982 because she was out on a qualifying run and she lost it in turn one and spun all the way down to turn 2, which is quite a long way.
A big spin.
Yeah, a big spin. No harm done, but that was the end of her attempt at Indy that year. And thinking about that makes me wonder if part of the reluctance to get women into Formula One may be because, just supposing one got in and, from time to time, people, as we've said in earlier episodes of this podcast, people from time to time are killed in Formula One, despite all the safety measures that have been put in place over the years. And you do have to wonder what would happen if there were a woman in Formula One and the worst happened, the unthinkable happened. Of course, nowadays there's an enormous amount of coverage whenever a male racing driver is badly injured in a Grand Prix. So you do wonder what might happen if that happened to a woman.
I think that's a good point. And actually, I've discussed that very point with Desiree Wilson, who said to me that she thought that was a fear that bothered Ken Tyrrell. Obviously, Ken Tyrrell ran the Tyrrell team that she raced for a time, and he couldn't quite square. I mean, he didn't want anyone to die in his cars, of course. No one does. Not a male driver, not any driver. But, a traditional old-school chap like Ken Tyrrell, she said you could just tell he found the very idea of a lady, as he might have said, rather than a woman, dying in one of his cars was just unthinkable.
Yep.
And he was never really comfortable, although he did run her for a while. Anyway, she was very quick, Desiree Wilson. Davina Galica wasn't quite as quick as Desiree, by Davina's admission, but she was as brave as anyone. She had some good results in the Shell Sport International Series in 1976 and 1977, a few podiums, and she was racing for the team run by one Charlie Whiting. Yes, the same Charlie Whiting, who then worked for Brabham and ended up being the long-time and still sorely missed, race director of the FIA, God rest him. But she never qualified for a proper Formula One Grand Prix. But I did say she was brave, didn't I? And she was. Before she took up racing, she'd been a downhill and giant slalom skier. She competed in the Olympics and she captained the British women's team in the 1968 and 1972 Winter Olympics. And for a while, she held the women's downhill skiing speed record, 125 miles an hour on skis, Richard, which takes a lot of courage, I reckon.
Well, it does. And I think downhill racers, actually men and women, are about the bravest of all. I used to spend quite a lot of time watching downhill racing, and I once stood in the start hut at Val d'Isère on the downhill course behind one of the women, actually, who was preparing to set off, and she was doing her kind of mental preparation. And I looked down, and it was just, it wasn't even the most frightening course on in the series, but it was like jumping off the top of a wall. And, to do what somebody like Galica did in speed skiing was just extraordinary.
Incredible. And then after that, when she hung up her own helmet, she spent most of her post-racing professional life as a driver coach, mostly in the States with the Skip Barber and Bertil Roos schools. And actually, that's what she was doing for us at W Series in 2019. She went round all the drivers, giving them pointers, tips, looking at their telemetry and answering their questions. She's great. I love Divvy, as she likes to be called. Anyway, Pat Moss aside, we focused a lot on circuit racing so far. But arguably, it's certainly arguable, the greatest female rally driver of all time was Michele Mouton. Would you agree, Richard?
Yes, and she took things on from where Pat Moss had left off in that sense and took things a stage further. She was born in 1951 in Grasse, where the perfume comes from, in Provence. And her dad had been a prisoner of war for 4 or 5 years, and he'd been a racing fan, but he sort of felt that he'd lost his career to that. So he encouraged her. So when she showed an interest, he taught her to drive in his deux chevaux. And then eventually she got hold of an Alpine, one of those lovely little Alpine A110s. Beautiful. I don't know if you remember those. Gorgeous,
I do. Beautiful cars.
Always in that perfect shade of blue. Yes. Beautiful cars.
Yes.
And she started rallying, and by within a year or two, she'd become the European and French ladies' champion. And then she moved on to drive for Fiat in a 131 Abarth and in a Lancia Stratos, and did well. And actually, in 1975, she had a go at Le Mans, and she, in an all-women crew. And it rained during the race when she was out there, and everybody hurried in to put rain tyres on, and she stayed out on slicks.
Really?
And actually overtook a lot of much better-known drivers. So it does kind of make you wonder what would have happened had she ever made the transition to circuit racing and maybe single-seaters and maybe Formula One. But, of course, her very famous period was in the early 80s when she went to Audi and joined the team that was racing Quattros.
Hannu Mikkela's teammate.
Hannu Mikkela and Walter Röhrl as well.
Yes.
And those were the first turbocharged four-wheel drive rally cars. And she won 4 major international rallies. First woman to do that. The first one was the San Remo in 1981. So, that established her as one of the greats. Then, she went on later in the 80s and drove for Peugeot. Do you remember those little 205 Turbo 16s?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
She drove those for a bit. But then she retired and had her family. But in 2010, she was made president of the FIA's Women and Motorsports Commission. So she's still involved.
Absolutely. And while you're on a roll, tell us a little bit more about someone else, because I was going to talk about Lynn St. James briefly. I will just quickly talk about it. I'll just say Lynn St. James, because I have mentioned Desiree Wilson and Divina Galitza, but Lynn St. James also helped us a lot at W Series. And she was I think, was she not the first person to be Rookie of the Year in the Indy 500, first female? Mm-hmm. And great woman, and I loved working with her at W Series. But she wasn't the first. Janet Guthrie, Richard, tell us about her.
Janet Guthrie, she was an aerospace engineer, actually. She was from Iowa City, and she started racing in the early 60s. In an XK140 in Sports
Jaguar,
Car, Sports Car Club of America races. And eventually she became full-time. And in 1976, she became the first woman to compete in a NASCAR super speedway race. And in 1977, she was the first woman to qualify and compete in the Indy 500. Although she became 29th, she retired with engine trouble, I think. But interesting that she tried and failed to qualify in 76 at Indy. The people have been pretty sceptical of her. But she was helped by A.J. Foyt, who you might think of as this kind of great macho hero of American racing. But Foyt, thought, she probably had the makings, and he lent her one of his Coyote Ford cars to go and try and qualify in. So that was interesting. Anyway, then she raced again at Indy in 78, and she actually came 9th, which was her best performance. But she had a wrist a fractured wrist, which she'd suffered in a charity tennis match 2 days earlier.
That actually was a tennis match, unlike Juan Pablo Montoya's tennis accident, if you remember that.
I do remember Juan Pablo Montoya's famous tennis injury. Yes. No, I think she really had done that. She raced in Indy cars 11 times, and she finished 5th in one race. She was the first woman ever to lead a lap of a NASCAR Winston Cup race. And generally she was a pretty good thing. And then eventually she married an airline pilot and retired.
And it was she who caused the famous phrase, "Gentlemen, start your engines." Tell us about that.
Well, they had to rethink that,
yes.
obviously, in 1977.
Yes.
And all sorts of arguments went on about what they should do. You know, should we say drivers start your engine, or lady and gentlemen, or whatever? But eventually, it was lady and gentlemen, and now
lady
and gentlemen.
Yes.
Now they adapt it to circumstances, I think.
Yeah. Well, just before we move on, I think it's worth saying something about somebody who we've just mentioned briefly, Giovanna Amati, who tried and failed to race in Formula One in 1992, which actually makes her the most recent female driver to have attempted it 32 long years ago. She came from a wealthy family, Italian as well, and she was kidnapped as a result. As a teenager, she was kidnapped and actually held hostage in a small wooden cage for 2 months. Just imagine that. When she was just a teenager, finally being released after what must have been an absolutely traumatic 2 months, incarcerated in this wooden cage, for a ransom of 800 million lira, and I've done the research, that was about £500,000 back then, which is 1978. It happened in 1978, which was a lot of money. Anyway, how she managed to get over that, we do not know, but to some extent she must have done so because she became a racing driver. And she worked her way up to Formula 3000. But she wasn't quick, we must concede that. And she failed to qualify her Lolas and Reynards in Formula 3000 as often as not. But she did manage to get herself into a Brabham Formula One car in 1992. She entered 3 Grand Prix. She failed to qualify for all of them. She was off the pace.
It was a terrible car.
It was a terrible car.
That year's Brabham was an appalling car.
It was a dreadful car. Yeah. And she was nonetheless, she was replaced by Damon Hill. I think we've heard of him, who was quicker in it, but still well off the pace because it was a terrible car. Anyway, Damon went on to do rather well in Formula One. I think we can all agree. Yeah,
I think with the greatest respect to Giovanna Amati, I think she's a rare example of a woman being given a chance in Formula One, basically because she was a woman. Her performances didn't justify it, and I think it was thought at the time, maybe by some people, it would be a good idea to have a woman in Formula One, and she was, around, give her a try. But anyway, and that's a good time to take our final ad break.
Welcome back to part 3, where we're going to jump into what we can probably call the modern era of women racing, or anyway, more recent history. And the first pioneering driver of the modern era I'd like to mention is Susie Wolff. Now, she was Susie Stoddart before she married Toto Wolff, obviously the team principal of the Mercedes Formula One team. And she was good in karting, good in Formula Renault, quite a few podiums. But she didn't get much of a chance in Formula 3, although she did try it, owing to injury. But then she threw herself into DTM, German touring cars, in which she raced actually for quite a few seasons and gradually got better and better. And then in 2014 and 2015, she did a number of free practice, FP1, FP2 sessions for Williams in Formula 1. And since she retired as a driver, she's been a leading light in the concerted effort to assist women drivers into the cockpits of racing cars wherever they may find that opportunity, working for Motorsport UK, what used to be the RAC MSA, the body that represents motorsport in the UK, now called Motorsport UK, working for its Dare to Be Different programme, which then soon merged with the FIA's Girls on Track programme. And then Susie headed up the F1 Academy, the race series for female drivers only, which still exists and supports Formula One today.
Yeah, I wonder what Susie Wolff thinks about her career, whether in other circumstances she would have made it into Formula One, whether, only she will know that, whether she would have been quick enough. But
well, maybe she won't know that. I mean, she might have a much better handle on it than anyone else, but whether you're a man or a woman, you can't know. If you've done karting, Formula Renault, a tiny bit of Formula 3 and some DTM, you can't know whether or not you would have made it or shone if you'd got to Formula One, I suppose, male or female.
I guess not. Anyway, I think the other more modern driver who deserves some discussion as a true trailblazer is Danica Patrick, who became a real superstar in the States. She's from Wisconsin, and she got into IndyCar racing, and she became the first woman to score an IndyCar win in Japan in the 300-mile race in 2008. She was the first woman to get a NASCAR pole position in the Daytona 500 in 2013. At the Indy 500, she was Rookie of the Year in 2005. And then in 2009, she finished third in the Indy 500, which is the highest finish by a woman ever. That was a fantastic performance. And she also finished seventh in the Daytona 500 in 2018. And all this, as I said, all this did make her a real superstar and made her slightly controversial as well, partly because she was very good looking. And some people, jealous of her success perhaps, or sceptical, compared it to Anna Kournikova, the very beautiful tennis player who never really achieved anything to match the publicity she got. But I think she's more like a Lindsey Vonn, who was also, looked terrific on the cover of Sports Illustrated, but, was a real winner and, absolutely deserved everything she got. But Danica Patrick certainly got some rewards. She's got a vineyard somewhere in America.
She's done very well.
She's done very well. She's got her own line of athleisure clothing, I believe it's called. She had a superstar quarterback boyfriend, Aaron Rodgers. She was a big name.
I think it's a bit churlish to berate her for being ultimately for being an attractive woman.
Well, absolutely. I couldn't agree. An attractive and very able, gifted,
and very
skillful.
Able. I mean, when you went through that tally of the things she's achieved on track,
yep.
I mean, it stacks up.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, we've discussed a wide range of pioneering and trailblazing. We've been using those words, pioneering and trailblazing female drivers. And there are others that we could have mentioned, but of course we can't and don't have time to mention everyone. But if I could name check just a few more, partly because of my time at W Series. I was at W Series in its early days, there for its launch or its announcement in 2018 and for its first season in 2019. And I enjoyed that enormously. So we should mention Jamie Chadwick, because she won the W Series Championship in 2019, 2021 and 2022. It didn't happen in 2020 because of COVID. But that does mean that she won all three W Series Championship because it only ran in those years. Pretty impressive.
Yes, impressive. But I'm going to butt in, Matt, and say if she was good enough to win those three series, three seasons of W Series, which was invented as a series to promote women in single-seater racing, why isn't she in F1 now?
Well, it's a good question, and obviously W Series mission would have been better borne out or franked, if you like, by events if she had been. If she was now racing for Ferrari and Formula One, the world of motorsport would be different indeed. But I think we just have to temper that with a few salient facts. I mean, Jamie is very nearly 26 now. So she was 24 when she won the last of those three W Series championships. And that was in a W Series Tatus Formula 3 car, which is a regional Formula 3 car, quite a bit slower, about 100 bhp less than an FIA International Dallara Formula 3 car. And let's put it this way. Even if she was a man and she'd won in a Formula Regional Tatus Formula 3 car at the age of 24, that's just far too old to be able to step up to International Formula 3 and probably do 2 seasons there because it requires that. And then step up again to Formula 2 and probably do 2 seasons there because that requires it too. And then be considered Formula 1. I mean, and I don't actually think that drivers are too old at 30-odd to make Formula 1 debut.
No, and they're certainly not too old to drive Formula 1 cars when they're in their late 30s.
Or 40s.
Or 40s, as we see from Alonso and Lewis. And
Lewis will be 40 when he first gets into a Ferrari.
Yeah.
And nobody, whatever your view, even if you're the most passionate Max Verstappen fan, you can't say that Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso aren't world-class Formula 1 drivers still, because they are. But back in the day, I mean, racing drivers arriving in Formula 1 in their late 20s and 30s was not at all unheard of. Mm. But I think I mentioned Verstappen, and I think that is one of the things. Max Verstappen got into Formula 1 when he was 17, raced his first championship Formula 1 Grand Prix at 17. And because he's been so incredibly successful, and we all have to concede he's one of the all-time greats already, but he's kind of set a fashion, I think, for youth in Formula 1. So sad to say, in my view, Jamie Chadwick is I know I'm 61, so I shouldn't be saying this, but she is just too old for Formula 1, I mean. Most W Series drivers were. But that doesn't mean that W Series wasn't setting them up to enjoy good, sustainable racing careers outside of Formula 1, because it was and did. I mean, take Jessica Hawkins, who I would regard as a friend. Obviously, I worked with her at W Series. And she didn't win races, but she got podiums in W Series. But in her defence, the fastest race car she'd competed in before W Series was the Mini Challenge. So big step up, never having really done single-seaters in any meaningful sense at all. I think she sat in a Formula Ford car a couple of times years before. Anyway, in 2021, when I was at Aston Martin, I hired her to be the Aston Martin Formula 1 team's driver ambassador. And she's now in her 4th season in that role, earning...
Excuse me, Matt, what does a driver ambassador do?
Yeah, good question. Driver ambassador, I mean, let's be honest, some of it is marketing and comms and PR and looking after sponsors and doing the kind of work that in those days the 2 race drivers, which were Lance Stroll then and now, and Sebastian Vettel when I was at Aston Martin. Could you please just go along to the Paddock Club and press some flesh and meet the people from Cognizant? How about no? Might be something that Vettel and Stroll might say, whereas Hawkins would say, yes, okay, when, and show me where and walk me there.
Okay, understood.
And so there is that side, but the quid pro quo and the benefit for her or him, because there are driver ambassadors or test drivers or reserve drivers who play similar roles in different teams. The quid pro quo is not only getting paid, but also association with the team, which is a good thing for the driver's CV, and sitting in on engineering debriefs, learning from actual world-class racing drivers like Sebastian Vettel, 4-time world champion, and listening to the engineers and so on and so forth. So people can be a tiny bit sniffy, like you almost were, about the term driver ambassador. But, if you were Jessica Hawkins' friend or father or manager, you'd be encouraging her to take that role. Mm-hmm. Anyway, she was the driver ambassador, or she is the driver ambassador, and as a result, she is racing this year in British GTs in an Aston Martin, part funded by Aston Martin as a result of her being the driver ambassador. And of course, money is incredibly important and very hard to come by for all racing drivers. And let's not forget, she is the most recent woman to have tested a current or very recent Formula 1 car, which she did last year, 2023, at the Hungaroring. And she was damn quick in it, actually. they didn't publish. I wasn't working for the team anymore.
In an Aston, this was.
In an Aston. Sorry, I forgot to say. Yes, she was in an Aston Martin as part of her role, and she tested that car at the Hungaroring. They didn't publish lap times, but I'm here to tell you, because I still have quite a lot of friends there, that her times were very good. No, not as quick as Fernando Alonso or Lance Stroll, but very good, particularly as she hadn't sat in one ever before. She'd done the simulator, but it's not the same as getting in the real thing. And she didn't shunt. She did everything right. By the way, she does shunt for a living, because one of the things she also does is she's a professional stunt driver, and she's done James Bond films. And she's very good at shunting to order.
Destroying Aston Martins.
Yes, absolutely. Pretty cool, anyway. And the last one I'd like to talk about of those W Series drivers is Alice Powell, another great woman. And I remember the first race we ever did in W Series was Hockenheim 2019, and we didn't know how good they were all going to be. Some had quite a lot of experience, like Jamie Chadwick, who duly won. But others had very little experience, like Jessica Hawkins, who hadn't raced for a while and had last raced a mini challenge car. And Alice Powell hadn't raced anything for 3.5 years. She'd given up on racing. She'd run out of money. Her dad runs a little building firm, and he had been doing odd jobs, that little building firms take on, and she was working for her dad as a builder's mate. And this is a remarkable story, I think. The day before we flew to Hockenheim, she had been helping him put in a new urinal in a men's toilet in a pub, and her job had been to take a sledgehammer to the old urinals, smash them to smithereens, and put the broken porcelain in a wheelbarrow and take it into a skip, and do that again and again. She did that, tough as old boots, she did that. Then she flew to Hockenheim, stuck it on the podium. How cool is that?
I can think of one or two male drivers from the past who drove as if they were smashing porcelain in a pub.
Well,
it's a great story.
It's one of the things that we realise is these women had been up against it. They'd had no advantages. Yeah. No one had helped them, and they'd had to just find a way of earning a living. But then, I don't think that's ever happened before.
So the question really at the end of all this discussion is, are we going to see a woman in Formula One anytime soon, as the saying goes? I would say myself, probably not anytime soon. I think the barrier is still too high. There are a couple... I have a couple of candidates that I'd like to see getting there or getting close to it or given a chance. One is they're both in their early 20s. One is Lilu Wadu, who races at Le Mans in endurance racing in GTs. And she is with AF Corsa, which is the work-supported Ferrari endurance racing team, and she actually tested last November, one of the 499P cars that won at Le Mans last year, came first and second, and she was really quick in it. She compared very well with the guys who've been driving it. So I think she's very talented. And the other is Sophia Flörsch, who is mostly famous for racing at Macau in 2018 in F3 and having the most appallingly spectacular crash when
dreadful
she just
to watch.
Flew. The car it wasn't her fault at all. She had nothing to do with it. But the car took off and flew into the photographer's stand, if I remember, and was caught on camera. And she had a 10-hour operation on a spinal fracture after that. And she was back the next season and became the first woman ever to score points in the European F3 Championship. Now, she once said of the W Series, she called it a step back for women in motor racing. So you can see her attitude. She's one of those people who wants to test herself against men all the time, which has not been proved to be the way forward. But I'm a bit agnostic about it. I have a lot of sympathy for women who think that something like W Series or F1 Academy, offers them a better chance. But I also have some sympathy for people who think in what you could call an independent way, I think.
And so do I. But my point about this is that they shouldn't be regarded as either or. It shouldn't be mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've just told a story about Alice Powell. Who would begrudge her that she hadn't been able to race because of lack of money? So I think it's churlish to say that series like W Series and the F1 Academy are making a grave mistake. But I respect people who have that view. And you mentioned Sophia Flosch, also Pippa Mann. They're both adamant that it's a grave mistake. Yep. But my answer to that is, you know, don't be cross about us at W Series or F1 Academy, because we're not cross about you. I mean, I don't work there anymore, but I did do. And, you know, the experiment of trying to get women into Formula One via conventional means, in other words, just getting them a drive in Formula 2 or Formula 3, has failed for the past 48 years. So that's quite a long, you know, run of failure. But good luck to you if you want to try it. And you know, nobody be happier than I if they had succeeded. And I know Sophia Flosch used to get quite aggressive, and so did Pippa Mann on Twitter and on other social media platforms, which is a bit tricky for me because I was the comms director of W Series at the time. So one had to say, I disagree with you, Pippa, I disagree with you, Sophia. But then, you know, you have to be careful not to be mansplaining, which is a very difficult thing to do if you're arguing with a woman about women's sport. So, you know, you then have to pipe down. But it was a tricky thing. But I have great respect for both Pippa Mann and Sophia Flosch, and I respect the opinion, even though I don't happen to hold it. My opinion is try to get more women through the funnel, try to get more women by hook or by crook into race cars, and then hopefully some of them will percolate through.
Well, we can agree on that.
Yeah. And by the way, while we're talking about that, you know, some people criticised W Series for not playing on, you know, the fact that they were women, you know, treating them exactly the same as male drivers and not playing on the fact that, you know, not dressing them in, you know, hot pants or something. And of course we didn't do that. But some people thought we should have done. I wouldn't have thought that was a good idea. They wouldn't have wanted it, and I don't think sponsors would have been drawn to it. But there is a racing driver who actually raced at W Series before, Caitlin Wood, an Australian, and she's got Barbie sponsorship in her Porsche Cayman. So she's racing in the Porsche Cayman Championship, which is a support series for the British Touring Car Championship. And, you know, her car's pink and it's got Barbie sponsorship. Well, some people might say, well, why should she be doing that? Well, whatever works. Mm. You know, you have to raise money to go racing. And why not do that? I think let's try to be less prescriptive about these things. Racing is hard enough as it is.
Yep. I mean, you've got the Iron Dames crew, as they're called, who race at Le Mans and in endurance racing. It's an all-women team of very talented women drivers.
By the way, talking of the Iron Dames, I'll tell you a tiny story there, which is one of them is Michele Gatting, the Danish driver. And I remember when W Series was beginning, and I was talking to another Danish driver, Kevin Magnussen. Now, I know Kevin Magnussen very well. I worked with him when I was at McLaren, and he was in the young driver the young driver program at McLaren. And then I worked with him when he raced for McLaren for that one season in 2014. And then I worked very closely with him when he was reserve driver, not driver ambassador, Richard, but reserve driver for 2015. And we've stayed close. Anyway, when I was explaining to him about W Series, and I'm going to go and work for W Series, Kev, what do you think? And he was, you know, he's an intelligent man and open-minded, and he was listening and putting, as you would expect, asking good questions and making good points. And then he said, I don't know if I should tell you this, but there is one woman you should definitely get hold of in your series. I said, who's that? He said, Michele Gatting. She's a Dane as well as me, and she's proper quick. And I said to him, do you mean proper quick? Do you mean, I'm just going to say this, I know it's not the right way to phrase it, but it is the kind of thing that male racing drivers sometimes say, particularly male Formula One drivers. Is she quick for a woman, or is she quick, like quick? And he looked at me and he said, she's quick. She's proper quick. And then he looked, you could tell he was thinking about what to say. And then he said, she sometimes beat me in karting. and then he kind of almost looked like he regretted having said it. But he was being honest.
Yeah.
And she was quick and is quick.
Yep, she is. Well, there have been lots of people that we haven't been able to mention, so apologies to all those fans of Gwenda Stewart or another female driver that you're a fan of. But,
Emma Kymäläinen, I should mention. There you are. She was a Finnish driver, and she was in W Series. She was our only mum, and she won a race.
Yeah.
That was cool.
Very good.
Very cool. Anyway, that probably feels like the perfect time to say, and colossally, that's history.
And a huge thank you for joining us for this episode, which is the penultimate one in our current run, and it's gone very quickly.
It has. It really has. But fear not, we have one more episode left in this series, which is Series 1, and it'll be a cracker. I know that sounds a bit self-congratulatory, but the subject matter will guarantee that it is a cracker. So keep your eyes out for that, and better yet, subscribe or follow the feed so you never miss an episode.
It's my pleasant duty this week to thank you for all the kind words about what we're doing on the podcast. And if you haven't yet given us your feedback, but you want to do so, here's Matt with how to get in touch.
That's right. You can reach us on podcasts at the-race.com or via social media. I'm at the Bish1 and Richard is at R. Williams 1947.
And that'll do us for this episode. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.